Our second speaker today is Andrew Towle, who is a graduating senior, majoring in psychology and minoring in English, theater, and university honors. One interesting thing that he writes about himself: I'm fascinated by the way our minds work and how we seek meaning in our day-to-day lives. I enjoy the works of Carl Jung, Chris Langan, and Jordan Peterson. Andrew's thesis is titled Coping with a Person with Borderline Personality Disorder in the Family, and his thesis advisor was Dr. William Langston. So let's welcome Andrew.
Is everybody doing okay? Good. I'm curious, has anybody here heard of borderline personality disorder? Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot more than I expected. Would any of you care to share something you know about BPD? Anybody? Just one thing you know. You don't have to give me a full picture. Yeah.
A lot of anger outbursts and extreme mood swings.
That's right. What about you?
I know that you have to see somebody as like perfect or just like absolutely failure.
What about you?
It's more diagnosed in women than men.
Uh-huh. That's true. Were you going to say something? Okay, same thing. Okay. Anybody else want to? You don't have to. That's fine. Okay. I've been interested in psychology for a long time. There's a lot of things in psychology that I like. One of the things I like most is studying personality disorders, especially borderline personality disorder. BPD was first recognized in the third version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. There were accounts of a certain type of patient with this disorder long before that, like 50 years before that, but not until 1980 did it get recognized. BPD is very hard to understand. It's a very complex disorder, and it's very misunderstood. It can be compared to bipolar disorder or to narcissism, which is narcissistic personality disorder, but it's actually distinctly different from these other disorders, and I'm going to tell you how. Bipolar disorder, people gravitate between episodes of mania and depression, and in between these episodes, most people return to a period of relative normalcy where they're not suffering or experiencing something like this. A personality disorder is different. Someone with a personality disorder has some real dysfunctional, difficult things in their thinking that affect how they view the world and how they view other people. BPD is very often misdiagnosed. In fact, 40% of people who end up with actually receiving a BPD diagnosis were previously diagnosed wrongly with bipolar. That's how often this is misdiagnosed. Like I said, BPD is hard to describe. I'm going to do my best for you. People with BPD are very emotionally reactive and impulsive. They're very attached to their loved ones, their family members, whether it's a significant other or their parents or their children. And any kind of perceived slight or insult is very difficult for people with BPD. There's no such thing as a mild insult for someone with BPD. When they are triggered, they can become very angry. They can have very intense outbursts, yelling and screaming and criticizing and accusing. And it's relentless when it happens. And it's not something that people around them can argue with. It is not rational at all. And when it happens, people living with someone with BPD learn they usually just have to let it run its course. Like you mentioned, Noah, people with BPD experience something called splitting. They have a very difficult time seeing people as either good or very difficult time comprehending the complexity of someone else. They tend to see people as all good or as all bad. There's no in between. They can often go from loving someone to literally hating someone in 5 minutes if they perceive an insult or a slight of some sort. Internally, people with BPD are in a lot of pain. They're in a lot of emotional turmoil. And in fact, many clinicians say people with BPD don't really know who they are on the inside. They have severe identity disturbance. You'll sometimes see people with BPD kind of switch up in their personality on different days if they're feeling a different way. They don't have multiple personalities per se, but they don't really understand themselves. So they're not very consistent with how they express themselves. People with BPD feel very empty on the inside. And they also tend to have, some people with BPD have paranoid ideation. They may be very into conspiracy theories and such. That's just one example of paranoid ideation. There's many. But the crux of BPD comes down to the first criteria in the DSM for the disorder, which is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. People with BPD have a very severe, underlying, interminable fear that they will be left alone by their family members. It's very intense, and they are not consciously aware of this, but it actually drives almost all of their behavior, all of their eccentric behavior. So why is this research necessary? Because see, I wasn't studying people with BPD. I was talking to people who were family members of someone with BPD. BPD strongly manifests itself with externalizing behaviors, which family members are on the receiving end of. And you could say that about a lot of mental disorders, but I would say people on the receiving end of BPD get the worst of it. The experience is very painful and traumatizing for family members of someone with BPD. And also this research was necessary because this disorder is very misunderstood and misdiagnosed. People with BPD tend to criticize and accuse their family members when they're upset, and they're upset a lot. It's very easy for them to get upset. Family members, especially at first, tend to not comprehend what's going on. They don't know why this person is so mad at them. They don't understand what they've done wrong, and they tend to be shocked by the people's behavior and bewildered, and it really lessens their self-esteem as well. It also causes long-term stress, especially in people who remain in a relationship with someone with BPD. This stress has been shown to lead to physical illness. People have gone blind. People in my study reported that one subject reported going blind due to the stress. And a clinician told him this. It was because of the stress he had incurred from his spouse having BPD and having to live with her. People who are family members often end up codependent on people with BPD. People with BPD are very reliant on them. When someone with the disorder is happy, they will praise their family members and they will love them strongly. And this is one of the reasons family members often end up codependent. But family members often experience guilt and shame and isolation because of the way that their family member treats them. And it's very tough on family members. As far as my study, I initially planned to interview about 12 family members for this. I ended up getting about 32. When I found bpdfamily.com, this was a site it was a forum site for support for family members of someone with BPD. I had a pretty overwhelming response to it. I could have gotten a lot more participants if I'd really wanted to, but I had to cut it off because I had about 60 pages of data to go through. Most of my questionnaire was very open-ended questions. I asked people about the behaviors they'd experienced, about their reactions, their handling, and their coping. And I got a ton of information. And in my thesis, I did my best to distill it. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. Almost everyone in the study described people with BPD as being very moody, extremely moody, erupting into anger just igniting in them when they were upset. Nearly everyone reported receiving unrealistic criticism and accusations. These things were often not based in reality, but that didn't take away from them being very hurtful. People with BPD were very commonly and in detail described as yelling, screaming, crying, incessant verbal abuse, and they also very commonly they would distort reality, and people with BPD were also very manipulative. These are just some quotes from some people said in my study. This is just a snapshot of what was said. There was a whole lot that people said about the behavior of people with BPD. Lots of yelling and screaming. Someone described how their family member, when they're upset, can sob for 12 hours straight until he passes out. This is not an exaggeration. The last one on this slide says the person lacked a sense of self, often a chameleon trying to fit in with others and act how she felt she would need to be accepted. The second one, a woman was describing how her mother, when the woman was a child, her mother's moods changed instantly and suddenly as if someone flipped a switch. And that happened with no explanation. She did not know what was going on when her mother did this. And there was a lot like this. As far as coping goes, all participants reported some combination of stress, guilt, fear, shock, and anger, and the like in response to their family member. Most people learned over time that something was wrong. They learned that this wasn't normal. One person said, "Now that I'm aware of BPD, I'm able to take what he says in a more detached and clinical way rather than taking it so personally." Many people tended to engage and try to react and correct their family member when they were first in a relationship with them, or for the children of people with it as they were growing up, they would react and engage, but they learned that this didn't work because people with BPD don't think rationally, and they can't think rationally in many circumstances. Some of the main ways people coped was mindfulness. People found that examining themselves and finding time alone to themselves helped them to understand what was going on. Some people reported meditating, or after an argument, they would go listen to music. They would go out, play sports, do something else to get their mind off of what just happened. Having a support system was very important for family members, whether it was a therapist or a friend or another family member, because this helped them to validate their experience and the chaos that they had experienced. Self-improvement was very important for people who had a family member with BPD. They found that listening to the accusations and criticism as someone with BPD would utterly wear them down. And if they didn't do something about it, they were going to deteriorate. And they were going to go crazy if they didn't. So mindfulness, outside support, and especially self-improvement was very important to family members. Something interesting I found in the data, no one said this directly, and the numbers didn't point to it directly, but a heavy theme of the data was that people's coping and their happiness and their outcomes actually decreased the longer they were in a relationship with someone with BPD, or connected to that person with BPD. There was no way to really improve on it over time, other than to understand that they weren't responsible and that they couldn't react to this behavior in kind because it would get them nowhere. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say for my research for now. But as far as the research process, just some tips for people who are writing a thesis. I recommend getting started early. When I first did this, I didn't know how I was going to recruit. I was asking around to mental health professionals in Nashville. I found out, according to HIPAA laws, I could not talk to any therapists or recruit from them, even for family members of people with BPD. Couldn't do it. It was off the table. So it was really hard, but once I found bpdfamily.com and contacted them and showed them I was serious about what I was doing, it helped a lot. If you're going to recruit for a study, I don't know if anyone here besides psychology majors will be doing a study, but if you do a study, networking is very important if you're trying to recruit from a certain population. Because like I said, for me, it was really difficult, and it took a lot of research to find the right resource to recruit from. Something else I think is very important is that qualitative research can be very biased. I've seen other students do qualitative research where they're looking for certain answers, or they're trying to prove a point. I don't like it, but people our age do it a lot in college, and I strongly advise you that if you do research like this, don't set out to prove a point. You can have something in mind, but your questions need to be objective, and you can't try to lead your participants to any certain kind of outcomes. I also recommend doing a little bit of work every day, whether it's working on your proposal, getting IRB approval, doing revisions, writing. After I got my study done, there was a ton of reading, annotating, and then a ton of writing that I had to do. I didn't do a little bit every day. I ended up procrastinating. It became very stressful at a couple points, but I got it done. So yeah, that's all for that. If you'd like to know more about my research process, I can definitely talk to you about it afterwards. But just a few thank yous. I want to say thank you to Dr. Langston. He's a professor in the psych department. He's great. He's funny. He's sane. He helped me a lot. He's not here today, unfortunately. Dr. Skip Johnson is the director at BPD Family. He's the guy who allowed me to recruit from them. A thank you to Dr. John Weil, Dean Weil, for his input on this project, both at my proposal and at the end. And thank you to Dr. Philip Phillips for his assistance and for letting me come out here and speak to you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
If you could go back, because you're mentioning the qualitative data, how you had open-ended questions, if you could go back and do this again or extend it further, would you choose a different methodology to have questions that would be more concrete, that would be easier to analyze?
Yeah, maybe. I wanted to keep it really open-ended. I thought about showing you all my questions. I actually did. I had to do a little bit. I knew it going in. I had to do a little bit of coaxing to get the right answers out of my participants, to get them to speak openly, because this was really sensitive stuff. But I tried to keep it open-ended and let them say as much as they wanted. I was happy to go back and pour through it 5-6 times over for themes. I could have done it more precisely, though. Yeah. Any other questions?
Tell us a little bit about the response that you got, because I thought that was one of the more unusual parts of your thesis was, am I remembering that people actually wanted you to keep your survey up longer and commented that not many other people had researched this?
Yeah. I was able to find 2 studies prior to this that did something similar. And I think the reason people were so eager to respond was because there's a dire need for it. BPD, like I said, is extremely misunderstood. If the numbers are correct, BPD is more prominent than bipolar disorder and other disorders in the general population, significantly. And like I also said before, I think the experiences of family members of someone with BPD are some of the worst of all mental disorders that exist. So I think people were dying to give me information. Yeah, the response was overwhelming, and I had to cut it off. Yeah.
You said there was like intersectionality between narcissistic personality disorder and BPD?
To some extent, yeah.
Oh, was there any intersectionality between BPD and antisocial personality disorder, which is really similar to narcissistic?
It's a good question. They overlap a lot. Yeah. Clinicians have some clinicians have thought of BPD as the female variant of antisocial personality disorder. They're different. They're a little bit different. People with BPD have a severe fear of abandonment. That's what motivates them to act this way. Most people with antisocial personality disorder don't have that, but they are very similar. That's a good observation. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that fear of abandonment is what kind of emphasis. So did you find any cases where, say, the back and forth between the person with BPD and then family members led to family members, I guess, showing symptoms or kind of showing similar, I guess, personality traits?
Absolutely. There was some research on this prior to my study that showed that many family members did end up codependent as a result. Some family members were consciously aware that they started to have this codependency and this fear of abandonment as a result. So yeah, good question. Sure.
Kind of like piggyback on his, you said codependency, but like, what about the anger outbursts and all, and those same kind of fears? Was it, I guess, kind of like, is it contagious? Kind of like,
Yeah. Some children of people with BPD can inherit some of the qualities of it, or even inherit the disorder. I think many people in a relationship or a marriage with someone with BPD had the opposite reaction. They realized how off the wall it was, and they made an effort to not be that way. A small percentage did say at times they had responded with anger and kind, but I don't think for anyone it became the same level of that, or even a disorder. No lasting effects of anger issues with other people, no. Good question. Yeah.
Is this kind of a disorder, is it strictly genetic, or can you develop it through traumatic instances like PTSD kind of deal?
like other mental disorders, it's a combination thereof. People with BPD, just like people who are bipolar or who are narcissists, have a genetic disposition to the disorder. But there are certain factors in childhood that result in the disorder actually occurring. So it's both. It's 50-50. Yeah. Good question. One more? Come on. I know someone wants to ask something. Yeah.
After you looked at data, what made you use it, analyze it, and get the results?
That's a good question. I read through it. I made little notes. I probably spent a good 15 hours reading and annotating and looking for patterns and then outlining it. And then going back and doing it again. I just had to read through it and find out what was important. I did use some of the prior research as a guide, of course. Any other questions? Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you.